I should have seen it coming, really. The whispers in the hallway that suddenly stopped when I walked by. The urgent meetings Patrick scheduled without me. The way he'd started CCing my team leads on emails that had always just been between us. But when you're neck deep in quarterly projections and fighting to keep your department not just afloat but soaring, you tend to miss the warning signs. Regina, we need to talk about your future with the company. Patrick didn't even offer me a seat when I entered his corner office that Tuesday morning. He stood behind his mahogany desk, shoulders squared, jaw set in that way that screamed he'd rehearsed this moment. I'd seen that expression before. When he fired Janet from marketing, when he demoted Carlos in operations. Is there a problem with my department's performance? I asked, remaining standing since he clearly wasn't interested in pretending this was a friendly chat. My team had just delivered our best quarter in 5 years. We'd secured the Anderson contract that 3 VPs had failed to land for 2 years straight. Our customer satisfaction scores were through the roof. It's not about performance metrics, Regina. It's about vision. He practically spat the word at me. The executive team needs forward thinkers, people who can see beyond next quarter, people with gravitas. That pause before gravitas said everything. How many times had I heard him praise my male colleagues for their commanding presence while suggesting I might benefit from assertiveness training? Our division has increased revenue by 28% this year alone, I countered, keeping my voice steady despite the heat rising to my face. We're projecting even stronger growth next. Numbers aren't leadership, Regina. Patrick cut me off with a dismissive wave. Anyone can manage a spreadsheet. What this company needs are leaders who inspire, who command respect naturally. I bit back the obvious retort. That respect is earned through results, not through Patrick's boys' club golf outings or his infamous whiskey strategy sessions that mysteriously never included the female executives. We're restructuring, he continued, not meeting my eyes now as he shuffled papers on his desk. Your position is being eliminated, effective immediately. HR has your severance package ready. They'll walk you through the exit process. Just like that. 6 years of exceeding targets, of building a department from 5 people to 50, of sacrificing weekends and holidays, erased in a 30-second speech that he couldn't even be bothered to deliver with eye contact. I see. And I did. See, I saw exactly what was happening. How Patrick had systematically pushed out every leader who didn't fit his narrow vision of what an executive should look like, sound like, be like. How he'd been consolidating power since becoming CEO 18 months ago, surrounding himself with yes-men who laughed at his jokes and validated his outdated management philosophy. Jennifer will be taking over your team, he added, referring to his recent hire. A woman 15 years my junior with half my experience but twice my willingness to agree with everything Patrick said. She's got some fresh ideas that align better with our strategic direction. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral even as I felt that familiar pressure in my chest, the one that shows up when you're being wronged but can't show it. May I have a moment to collect my personal items? He glanced at his watch. Security will accompany you. Standard protocol for executive separations. Translation. He thought I might steal company secrets or sabotage something on my way out. As if I'd built my reputation on integrity just to torch it over his fragile ego. Of course, I replied, my voice cool as winter. I understand completely. And I did understand. I understood that Patrick had no idea who he was really dealing with. No clue about the storm that was about to hit him. As I walked out of his office for what he thought was the last time, I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I smiled. Just a tiny one, at the corner of my mouth where he couldn't see it. Because sometimes, the most powerful move you can make is to let your opponent think they've won, especially when you're holding the ultimate trump card. I've never been one for dramatic exits. So when Patrick's security transition assistant, shadowed me to my office, I simply boxed up my framed certificates, the photo of my dad and me at my college graduation, and that silly World's Best Boss mug my team gave me last Christmas. I didn't take the company laptop. Didn't need to. Everything important was already securely backed up according to protocol. "Do you need a cab, Ms. Harrington?" The security guy, Mike, I think, looked genuinely uncomfortable with his assignment. He'd worked the front desk since I started at the company. "I'm fine, Mike. My car's in the garage." I smiled at him. No hard feelings. He was just doing his job. As I drove away from the gleaming glass tower with our company logo splashed across the top, my company logo, though Patrick didn't know that yet, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding all morning. Not a sigh of defeat. More like the measured exhale of a chess player who's just watched their opponent fall for a carefully laid trap. You see, Patrick thought he knew everything about Harrington Innovations. He thought his swift rise from COO to CEO after my father's death meant he understood the company's structure, its history, its very DNA. But there was one critical detail missing from his knowledge base, a detail my father had orchestrated with meticulous care. I pulled into the parking lot of Garner & Associates, the family law firm that had handled my father's affairs for 3 decades. Eleanor Garner was waiting for me, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed documents at her conference table. "Right on schedule," she said, not looking up. "Patrick finally pulled the trigger?" "Just as we predicted," I confirmed, settling into the chair across from her. Cited lack of vision and leadership qualities. Eleanor finally met my eyes, a spark of amusement in hers. Interesting assessment from someone who can't see what's right in front of him. Eleanor had been my father's closest confidant and the architect of his succession plan. She slid a folder across to me, the trust documents we'd reviewed a dozen times since Dad's passing 2 years ago. The trust that legally transferred 90% of Harrington Innovations shares to me, effective on my 30th birthday, which had been 3 weeks ago. "Everything's finalized," she confirmed. "The share transfer was completed and registered with the SEC last week. You are now, officially and irrevocably, the majority shareholder of Harrington Innovations." I ran my fingers over the embossed company logo on the folder. "And Patrick has no idea." "None whatsoever," Eleanor confirmed, unable to suppress a small smile. "Your father was very specific about keeping the trust structure private until this transfer was complete. The remaining 10% is distributed among the board members and senior executives, including Patrick's 2%. He's been operating under the impression that those distributed shares represent the company's entire ownership. Dad had built Harrington Innovations from his garage 40 years ago. He'd taken it public, then strategically repurchased shares, through holding companies and investment vehicles year after year. By the time he was diagnosed with cancer, he'd re-privatized almost the entire company without anyone realizing it. His last corporate chess move. "Has the board been notified?" I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "The official notice goes out tomorrow morning, with documentation for the emergency shareholder meeting on Friday." Eleanor handed me another document, the meeting agenda. Item 1. Leadership restructuring. 3 days, I murmured. 3 days until Patrick realizes what's happening. "Your father would be proud," Eleanor said quietly. "Not just of the plan, but of how you've handled yourself. Lesser people would have gloated immediately." I shook my head. "That's not the point. This isn't about humiliating Patrick or some dramatic revenge. It's about protecting what Dad built, the company culture, the innovation pipeline, the people who've poured their lives into making Harrington what it is." "Still," Eleanor said, gathering her papers, "I wouldn't mind being a fly on the wall when Patrick gets the meeting notice." I allowed myself a small laugh then. I've earned at least that much satisfaction, haven't I? As I left Eleanor's office, clutching the folder with my future, and the company's future inside, I felt strangely calm. Not the false calm that comes from denial or shock, but the deep stillness that accompanies absolute certainty. My father had trusted me with his legacy, and Patrick's short-sighted power play had just accelerated the timeline for me to honor that trust. My phone buzzed with messages from my team, concerned texts asking what happened, if I was okay, if the rumors were true. I'd respond to them soon, but not yet. For now, I needed these few days of quiet preparation, because while Patrick was busy congratulating himself on consolidating power, I was about to remind him, and everyone else, what real leadership looks like. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, weird, right? But from a strange mix of anticipation and reflection. I found myself in Dad's home office, the one room in the house I'd kept exactly as it was since he passed. His leather chair still held the impression of his body, and his reading glasses still rested on top of industry journals he'd never finish. Behind his desk hung the first dollar Harrington Innovations ever earned, framed alongside a photo of Dad shaking hands with our first major client. I'd always known I'd follow in his footsteps someday, but neither of us had imagined it would happen like this. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out the sealed envelope he'd left for me. For Regina, open on your 30th birthday, written in his bold, slashing handwriting. I'd opened it 3 weeks ago, but tonight felt like the right time to read it again. My dearest Regina, it began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting next to me. If you're reading this, then Eleanor has executed the trust transfer as planned, and you now hold the keys to everything we've built together. I've watched you grow from the curious little girl who used to sit on my lap during board meetings to the formidable business leader you've become. You've earned this not through birthright, but through your own merit. I paused, running my finger over the words. Dad had never been overly sentimental, but his final months had softened him. I've made many decisions for Harrington Innovations over 4 decades, some brilliant, others less so. But appointing Patrick as interim CEO may prove to be my greatest miscalculation. By the time I recognized his true character, my illness had progressed too far to make another change without destabilizing the company. So instead, I created this plan, this safety net, to ensure that my mistake wouldn't become the company's undoing. The next part made me smile through the tears that had started to form. I've no doubt Patrick will show his true colors before long. His talent for managing up has always exceeded his capacity for genuine leadership. When that moment comes, when he inevitably tries to push you aside, remember that I've given you everything you need to restore balance. The timing of this transfer is deliberate. I wanted you to experience Harrington without the protection of being the founder's daughter, to understand what our people face daily, to see, with clear eyes, what works and what doesn't. Dad had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone else. Even from beyond the grave, he was still teaching me. The board members don't know about this arrangement, except for Eleanor. That was intentional. I needed to see who would stand on principle when tested, who would challenge Patrick's worst impulses without knowing a safety net existed. Watch carefully who has shown courage these past months. Those are the allies you'll need. The letter continued with specific notes about key projects, potential partnerships, and his hopes for the company's direction. But it was the final paragraph that I kept coming back to. Leadership isn't ownership, Regina. Nor is it power for power's sake. True leadership is stewardship, the humble recognition that we're temporary caretakers of something larger than ourselves. The shares I've left you aren't a weapon for revenge, though I suspect Patrick may have given you ample reason to seek it. They're tools to rebuild what matters, a company where innovation thrives because people know they matter more than quarterly projections, where diversity of thought isn't just tolerated but essential, where the values written on our lobby wall actually guide our decisions. I trust you completely, not just with the company, but with the community of people who've devoted their professional lives to our shared vision. Make it yours now. Shape it. Improve upon what I began. And when the time comes, find someone worthy to pass it to, as I've found in you. All my love and confidence, Dad. I carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the document I'd been working on for weeks, my vision for Harrington's future. The plan I would present after Patrick's removal. The roadmap that would honor my father's legacy while forging a new path forward. Outside, dawn was breaking. In a few hours, Patrick would receive the shareholder meeting notice. In 3 days, I'd walk back into the building he'd had me escorted from. But tonight, in the quiet of my father's office, surrounded by the artifacts of his remarkable life, I wasn't thinking of Patrick or revenge or even the dramatic scene to come. I was thinking about responsibility, about legacy, about the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods and professional fulfillment were now ultimately in my hands. I owed them more than a power play. I owed them leadership worthy of their talent and commitment. Dad had trusted me with that sacred obligation, and I wouldn't let him or them down. The next morning, I met with Eleanor and her team to finalize every detail of Friday's shareholder meeting. We gathered in the private conference room at Garner & Associates, walls covered with strategy documents, legal filings, and company organizational charts. The meeting notice went out at 8 a.m., Eleanor's associate confirmed, sliding a tablet across the table. Corporate email system confirms delivery to all board members and eligible shareholders. I checked the time. 8:47 a.m. Patrick would have seen it by now. Right on cue, my phone rang. A block number. I raised an eyebrow at Eleanor, who nodded slightly. I put it on speaker. Regina Harrington speaking. Regina. Patrick's voice was artificially casual, with that strained quality it got when he was suppressing rage. There seems to be some confusion. I just received notice of an emergency shareholder meeting calling for leadership restructuring? Obviously, this is some kind of clerical error. No error, Patrick, I replied evenly. The meeting will proceed as scheduled on Friday at 2 p.m. A pause. I don't understand. You're no longer with the company. How are you involved in this? I could practically see him at his desk, necktie loosened, that vein in his forehead pulsing the way it did when challenges arose that weren't in his script. All will be explained at the meeting, I said. I suggest you review the full documentation, attached to the notice. This is absurd. You can't just call a shareholder meeting. You don't have the authority. Actually, as majority shareholder, I have exactly that authority. The notice includes verification from the corporate secretary and meets all requirements under both company bylaws and state law. There was a long silence, followed by the sound of rapid typing. He was probably pulling up the attachments he'd ignored in his initial outrage. This is impossible, he finally said, voice hollow with disbelief. There must be some mistake. The ownership structure. This can't be right. It's entirely correct, Patrick. I'll see you Friday. I recommend you prepare your transition notes. I ended the call before he could respond. Eleanor gave me an approving nod. That, she said, would have made your father cackle with delight. But there was no time to savor the moment. We had 2 days to prepare for every possible scenario. Patrick wouldn't go down without a fight, and I needed to be ready. The rest of the day dissolved into a blur of preparation. We held a secure video call with 3 board members I suspected would be sympathetic to our cause, showing them previews of the documentation they'd receive at the meeting. Their shock quickly turned to understanding, then resolute support when I outlined my vision for the company's future. I always wondered how Thomas maintained such control despite going public, mused Diane Forrester, our longest-serving board member. This explains so much. And frankly, Regina, it's about time. Patrick's leadership has been concerning. That's diplomatic phrasing, said James Chen, head of our audit committee. Morale is tanking, innovation has stalled, and we've lost 17 senior employees in 18 months. The board has been discussing intervention options for weeks. Their support was encouraging, but not surprising. Dad had chosen his board members carefully, people of integrity who cared about more than just quarterly returns. By Wednesday afternoon, we'd secured tentative support from a majority of the board. Not that we needed it, given my voting power, but I wanted this transition to be as smooth as possible. The company had endured enough disruption. Thursday was dedicated to the future, refining my strategic plan, preparing the announcements we'd make to employees and clients, establishing the new organizational structure. I spent hours with HR planning how to handle the inevitable questions and concerns that would emerge. "Will you be making other leadership changes?" asked Marianne from HR, who'd worked with my father for 20 years and had agreed to meet me confidentially at Eleanor's office. "Only where absolutely necessary," I assured her. "This isn't about clearing house, it's about course correction." She nodded approvingly. "The mood's been grim lately. People are afraid to speak up, afraid to take risks. That's not the Harrington way." "No," I agreed. "It's not, and it stops tomorrow." That night, I laid out my outfit for the meeting. Not the power suit most would expect for such a confrontation, but a simple blue dress my father had always said brought out the determination in my eyes. I wanted to walk in as myself, not as some corporate warrior princess. As I tried to fall asleep, my phone lit up with a text from an old colleague who still worked at Harrington. "Office is buzzing with rumors. Patrick's been locked in meetings with lawyers all day. Security protocols changed. Something big happening?" I didn't respond. By this time tomorrow, everyone would know exactly what happened. The silent preparation was almost complete. The corporate coup, though I preferred to think of it as a restoration, was just hours away. Friday dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that felt deliberately cinematic, as if the universe wanted to underscore the significance of what was about to happen with flawless weather. I arrived at Eleanor's office early to review our strategy one final time. "Patrick's called in additional security," she informed me, glancing at her phone. "Our source says he's stationed guards at every entrance." I smiled. He always did have a flair for the dramatic. "Are you ready for this?" Eleanor asked, studying my face. "Once we walk through those doors, everything changes," I finished. "I've been ready since the day he fired me." We arrived at Harrington Tower 40 minutes before the scheduled meeting. As expected, security was tight, uniformed guards checking credentials at every entrance. But Patrick had overlooked one detail: the executive garage. My access card, which HR had mysteriously forgotten to deactivate, still worked. Some small act of rebellion from someone who knew what Patrick was, perhaps. Eleanor and I rode the Y, private executive elevator directly to the board level. When the doors opened, we came face to face with Patrick's assistant, Melissa, whose jaw literally dropped at the sight of me. "Ms. Harrington, you can't be here." Mr. Donovan said, "It's quite all right, Melissa," I said gently. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "The board is gathering in the main conference room?" She nodded mutely, too shocked to resist as we walked past her desk. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see board members already, seated, speaking in tense, hushed tones. Patrick stood at the head of the table, back to the door, gesturing emphatically about something. "Perfect timing," Eleanor murmured. I paused at the door, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. Conversation halted mid-sentence. Heads turned. Patrick froze mid-gesture, then slowly turned to face me, his expression cycling rapidly from shock to rage to forced composure. "Regina," he said with artificial pleasantness that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a closed board meeting. Security will escort you out." "Actually," I replied, my voice steady as I moved to the table. "As majority shareholder, I believe I have a seat at any company meeting." I placed the ownership documents Eleanor had handed me on the polished mahogany surface and slid them toward the center of the table. For those who haven't had a chance to review the full documentation sent with the meeting notice, these records confirm that I currently own 90% of Harrington Innovations shares, transferred to me through my father's estate trust 3 weeks ago. The room erupted into murmurs. Board members reached for the documents, passing them around, examining the legal seals and signatures with widening eyes. Patrick slammed his hand on the table. This is preposterous. A desperate ploy from a disgruntled former employee. The company, ownership structure is well established, is deliberately obscured through a series of holding companies my father established. I finished for him. A structure that consolidated back to his personal trust upon his death, with transfer to me as beneficiary on my 30th birthday. Eleanor Garner, as trustee, can verify the authenticity of these documents, I continued, nodding toward Eleanor, who had taken a seat near the door. As can our corporate counsel, who received official notification last week. Corporate counsel, a silver-haired man who'd worked with my father for decades, cleared his throat uncomfortably. I can confirm that these documents appear legitimate and have been properly filed with all relevant authorities. Patrick's face had gone from red to white. Why wasn't I informed of this immediately? He demanded of the counsel. Client confidentiality, the lawyer replied simply. The instructions from Thomas Harrington were explicit. I moved to the seat directly opposite Patrick, not trying to literally take his place, but positioning myself as his equal. I've called this meeting for a single purpose, to realign Harrington Innovations with the values and vision that made it successful, values that have been systematically dismantled over the past 18 months. Several board members nodded subtly. As majority shareholder, I moved to remove Patrick Donovan as CEO, effective immediately. My voice remained calm, professional, no hint of the personal satisfaction I couldn't help but feel. I second the motion, said Diane Forrester without hesitation. You can't just... Patrick sputtered, looking desperately around the table for support that wasn't materializing. All in favor? I asked. Hands raised around the table. Not just my allies, but every board member except Patrick himself and his one remaining loyalist. Motion carries, I declared. Patrick, thank you for your service to the company. Human Resources will manage your transition package. Security will escort you to clear out your office. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The same ritual he'd subjected me to now being turned back on him. You'll regret this, he hissed, standing so abruptly, his chair rolled backward, and hit the wall. All of you, the projects in development, the partnerships I've cultivated, you have no idea what you're throwing away. I met his gaze steadily. We're not throwing away anything worth keeping, Patrick. That's rather the point. As security appeared at the door, summoned by Eleanor with a discreet text, Patrick gathered his papers with shaking hands. This company will collapse without me. You'll be begging me to come back within 6 months. I smiled, not unkindly. I wish you well in your future endeavors, Patrick. Truly. After he was escorted out, I turned back to the stunned board. I know you have questions. I'm prepared to answer all of them. But first, I'd like to present my vision for Harrington's future, the restoration of what made this company great, and the evolution needed to make it even stronger. As I opened my presentation, slides I'd prepared during those quiet nights, after my termination, I felt my father's presence so clearly it was almost tangible. This was his legacy, but it was becoming my story now. The dramatic boardroom return wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning. The first week after Patrick's removal was a whirlwind. I moved back into my old office, not Patrick's corner suite, which felt too symbolic of the hierarchy I wanted to dismantle. The message needed to be clear. This wasn't about me claiming a throne. It was about restoring balance to a company that had lost its way. My first official act as CEO was to call an all-hands meeting. No glossy presentation, no corporate buzzwords. Just honest communication about what had happened and what would happen next. Many of you have worked alongside me for years, I began, looking out at hundreds of familiar faces in our main auditorium. Others know me only as Thomas Harrington's daughter, or more recently, as that VP Patrick fired. Today, I'm speaking to you as Harrington Innovation's CEO and majority shareholder. But more importantly, I'm speaking as someone who cares deeply about what we build here. Not just our products, but our culture. I told them everything about my father's succession plan, about my observations during Patrick's tenure, about my commitment to restoring what had been lost while evolving, what needed to change. I won't pretend the last 18 months haven't been difficult. I've heard your frustrations, the fear of speaking up, the projects shelved without explanation, the colleagues who left or were pushed out because they didn't fit a narrow definition of cultural fit. That ends today. I outlined my first initiative, People First. Not just an HR program, but a fundamental recommitment to the principles my father had established. That innovation comes from people feeling safe enough to take risks. That diversity of thought is our greatest competitive advantage. That work should be challenging but sustainably so. Starting tomorrow, I'll be holding listening sessions with every department. No managers present, just open conversation about what's working, what isn't, and what you need to do your best work. The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone started clapping. Others joined in, until the applause became a standing ovation that caught me completely off guard. Not because I'd given some brilliant speech, but because people were so desperate for authentic leadership that even the promise of being heard felt revolutionary. Those listening sessions revealed the full extent of the damage Patrick had caused. Projects abandoned because they were championed by people who'd questioned him. Talented employees stuck in dead-end positions because they weren't part of his inner circle. A culture of fear where mistakes were punished rather than learned from. But they also revealed incredible resilience. Secret collaborations that had kept innovation alive despite Patrick's controlling management. Managers who'd protected their teams by filtering his worst directives. People who'd stayed not because of leadership, but despite it. Because they believed in what Harrington could be. I spent my evenings reviewing the organizational structure Patrick had created, top-heavy with loyalists, while experienced directors who'd served the company for years were sidelined. With Eleanor's counsel, I began the delicate work of restructuring without causing more trauma to an already stressed system. Maria Chen, who'd been demoted from Director of Innovation to a vague, special projects role after challenging one of Patrick's pet initiatives, was restored to her position and given expanded authority. James Washington, who'd resigned rather than implement cuts to our education partnership program, agreed to return as Chief Community Officer, a new role focused on our relationships with the schools, nonprofits, and community organizations that had always been part of my father's vision. 3 weeks in, we launched our first major initiative under the new leadership, the Harrington Innovation Grant. $5 million allocated to employee-led projects that had been shelved under previous management. Any employee could submit a proposal. Selection would be made by a cross-functional committee, not executive decree. "You're channeling your father," Eleanor observed over lunch one day. "He always said the best ideas rarely come from the corner office." "I'm learning that leadership is mostly about removing obstacles," I admitted. "Getting out of people's way while giving them what they need to succeed." Not everything was smooth, of course. Patrick had made promises to partners that we couldn't always honor. Some executives who'd thrived in his environment struggled with the new expectations around collaboration and transparency. A few chose to leave, which was ultimately healthier for everyone. The most challenging moment came when I discovered Patrick had been preparing to offshore nearly a third of our development team, a cost-cutting measure he'd hidden from the board. The contracts were drafted, the timeline established. Stopping it meant renegotiating vendor agreements and revising our entire product roadmap. I called an emergency meeting with the development leaders. "I need your honest assessment," I told them. "Not what you think I want to hear. Can we maintain our innovation edge without this move?" Their relief at being consulted was palpable. Together, we crafted an alternative that preserved jobs while still addressing the efficiency concerns Patrick had legitimately identified. It would take longer, and cost more in the short term, but would strengthen rather than fracture our core. Team. 4 months in, the culture shift was becoming visible. Meeting rooms once dominated by the same few voices now hummed with diverse perspectives. The innovation pipeline, which had narrowed to projects that fit Patrick's limited vision, expanded to include initiatives that might not drive immediate revenue but aligned with our broader mission. Most telling was the return of spontaneous collaboration. Engineers and designers gathering in common spaces to sketch ideas, cross-departmental lunches where problems were solved informally, the buzz of creative energy that had once defined Harrington at its best. People seem happy again, observed our head of facilities as we toured a floor being renovated to create more collaborative workspace. Not just busy, actually happy to be here. That, I realized, was the true measure of our rebuilding efforts. Not financial metrics, though those were improving too. Not industry recognition, though that would come. But the restoration of purpose, the sense that our work mattered, and that each person mattered to that work. By the 6-month mark, when Patrick had predicted we'd be begging for his return, Harrington Innovations was instead announcing our strongest quarter in 3 years. The press release didn't mention his name or make comparisons to previous leadership. We were too busy looking forward to dwell on what we'd left behind. 1 year to the day after my unceremonious escort from the building, I stood at my office window watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in hues of gold and pink. The symbolic weight of the anniversary wasn't lost on me, but it felt less like remembering a wound, and more like celebrating how far we'd come. My assistant, Zoe, knocked softly before entering with my morning coffee. "The executive team is ready." "Whenever you are," she said. "And the quarterly results just came in." I smiled, accepting the steaming mug. "Let me guess, we exceeded projections again?" "By 17%, she confirmed. "Finance is practically doing cartwheels." The numbers told one story of our transformation. 4 consecutive quarters of growth. Stock value up 34% since Patrick's departure. Employee retention improved by a staggering 65%. And our innovation pipeline fuller than it had been in 5 years. But the metrics that mattered most to me weren't on any official report. Lunch tables filled with animated conversation. The resurrection of Failure Friday, where teams shared what hadn't worked and what they'd learned. The dramatic increase in cross-departmental collaboration. The fact that our job postings now routinely drew hundreds of qualified applicants because word had spread about what we were building. I gathered my tablet and headed to the conference room, no longer the imposing mahogany fortress of Patrick's era, but a bright space with glass walls and a round table that physically reinforced our commitment to collaborative leadership. The executive team rose as I entered, but I waved them back to their seats. "Let's keep this informal," I suggested. "We've got a lot to cover." Looking around the table, I felt a surge of pride in the leadership team we'd assembled. Some were veterans who'd weathered the Patrick era, staying despite the challenges because they believed in the company's mission. Others were new faces we'd recruited specifically for their alignment with our values. Together, they represented exactly the diversity of thought, experience, and perspective that drive genuine innovation. Before we dive into the agenda, I want to acknowledge something. Exactly 1 year ago today, I was escorted from this building, told my leadership wasn't what the company needed. A few knowing smiles around the table. It would be easy to frame today as some kind of vindication or victory lap. "If anyone's earned a victory lap, it's you," said James Washington, our chief community officer. I shook my head. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to avoid. What we've accomplished this year isn't my victory. It's what happens when hundreds of talented people are given the space, resources, and permission to do their best work. My job, our job, I gestured around the table, is to maintain that environment, not take credit for what grows within it. We moved through the agenda efficiently, reviewing the quarterly results, discussing challenges on the horizon, finalizing details for next week's launch of our most ambitious new product line. The conversation flowed naturally, with disagreements emerging and being worked through respectfully, so different from the tension-filled meetings of the previous regime where dissent was viewed as disloyalty. After the executive meeting, I headed to R&D for our monthly CEO Shadow Day, where I embedded with different teams to understand their daily reality. Today, I'd be with the UX research group, observing user testing on our newest interface. "You're getting the full experience today," warned Sanjay, the research lead. "We've got some particularly expressive users scheduled." I laughed. "The more candid, the better. We don't improve by hearing what we want to hear." Those 6 hours watching real people struggle with features our internal team thought were intuitive, and succeed with elements we'd been uncertain about, was worth more than a dozen strategy sessions. I took pages of notes, asking questions not as CEO, but as a curious learner trying to understand both the product and the process. When I finally returned to my office that evening, I found a small package on my desk with a note from Eleanor. "Your father asked me to give you this today. He was very specific about the timing." Inside was a weathered leather-bound journal, my father's ideas notebook that I'd seen him carry for decades. Tucked between its pages was a handwritten note. "Regina, if Eleanor has delivered this as instructed, you've now completed your first year as Harrington's true leader. I suspect it's been quite a year. This journal contains 40 years of midnight, inspirations, false starts, and occasional breakthroughs. Some led to our greatest successes. Others taught me my most valuable lessons. It's yours now, not to follow, but to build upon. Add your voice to mine. Then someday, pass it to someone, worthy of continuing what we've built. With boundless pride and love, Dad." I ran my fingers over his familiar handwriting, tears blurring my vision. Not tears of sadness, but of profound connection. To my father, to the company he'd created, to the future we were building. My phone chimed with a text from Maria Chen. "Engineering team just solved that rendering issue we've been stuck on for weeks. Celebratory pizza happening in Lab 3 if you're still around." I smiled, tucking the precious journal into my bag. The past had given me the foundation I needed, but the present was calling. And if the first year of this new era was any indication, the future of Harrington Innovations would exceed even my father's ambitious dreams. As I headed toward the sounds of celebration echoing from the lab, I reflected on everything we'd overcome and created in just 12 months. Patrick had been right about one thing. Leadership is about vision. But he'd misunderstood what vision truly means. It's not about seeing what others can't. It's about helping others see what's possible when we build together. The journey from shocked ex-employee to confident CEO had transformed not just the company but me as well. I'd discovered that true power comes not from control but from trust. In yourself, in your team, in the values that guide your decisions when the path forward isn't clear. "There she is," called Sanjay as I entered the crowded lab. "The boss, who actually wants to hear when we mess up." Laughter rippled through the room. Someone handed me a slice of pizza. A dozen conversations flowed around me. Technical debates, creative brainstorming, friendly banter. The beautiful, messy hum of a healthy organization. This, I realized, was my father's greatest legacy. Not the shares that had given me control, but the understanding that a company isn't buildings or products or even profits. It's people, connected by shared purpose, empowered to bring their full selves to work that matters. And as I joined my colleagues in celebrating not just a technical breakthrough, but the collaborative culture that had made it possible, I knew we'd truly begun a new era, not just for Harrington Innovations, but for what business leadership could and should be. Patrick's name was rarely mentioned anymore. Not because we were avoiding the past, but because we were too busy creating the future. A future built on inclusion rather than intimidation, collaboration rather than control, and the simple but revolutionary idea that the best leaders aren't those who demand power, but those who distribute it. 1 year later, that principle had transformed a struggling company into a thriving community of innovation, and we were just getting started.